All right, we are going to return to our study tonight that we began last Wednesday night. I do have a written outline for you tonight. Did not have that last week, and the first 2 points that are on the sheet there are some of the ones that we talked about last week. I'm going to revisit some of that stuff. But just to remind you while we're doing this, we have just entered into the season of the Lottie Moon Christmas offering for international missions. And for those of us who grew up in the Baptist church, that's probably a name that we've been hearing the vast majority of our life, and we may be very familiar with that, but that is not the case for everyone. Had lunch with several pastors in our area yesterday, and one of them was the fairly new pastor. He's been at Maranatha Baptist Church out on Kiwi School Road for a couple of years, but he did not grow up in a traditional Southern Baptist church. It was a Baptist church, but not one that had all the traditions like we did. And after being at the church for some short period of time, David Shirley said that he called David one day and said, "David, I got a question for you, man." He said, "You know I'm here at Maranatha and I'm trying to figure out all this stuff, and I just got to ask you, who is Lottie and who is Annie? Because I keep hearing about these ladies." And and then I heard another story. David was telling a story about he was in church. I think it was here at Utica. He was telling a story when he was a young boy. He said he still can feel the pinch where Margaret Shirley, his mom, who I still call Meemaw pinched the part of his, he said, the hanging down part of my arm. She pinched it real good because they were talking about these missions offerings, and they brought up Annie and Lottie, and somebody in the back said, "When are we going to pay these ladies off?" and David said, "Ah!" And then his mom pinched his arm. So I realize that many of us have a lot of knowledge about who these ladies are. But even those of us who have more knowledge than others probably don't have as much as we should. So as I told you last week, I've been spending some time reading through a couple of biographies about Lottie Moon, and the one that I'm really enjoying is by Janet and Jeff Bengi, called Lottie Moon, Giving Her All for China. And the more I read about this phenomenal lady, the more encouraged and inspired and motivated I am as a Christian. So I want to continue to share from her life. We will definitely stay with her at least through next week, and more than likely we'll have enough to continue studying her life each of the Wednesdays in December. But just by way of a little bit of review for those of you who weren't here last week, Lottie Moon was born Charlotte Diggs Moon on December the 12th, 1840. She was born into a fairly wealthy, prominent family in Virginia, in Albemarle, Virginia. And even though she was raised in a Christian home, she was not a Christian until she was 19. She came to trust Christ basically as a college student at Virginia Albemarle Institute for Females. But one of the things we talked about last week is that this first major stage of Lottie's life, when she heard the call from the Lord to be a Christian, is that she became a purposeful Christian right off the bat. She was not one of those that just had a nominal relationship with Christ, where she walked down the aisle of a church and made a profession of faith and got baptized, and then nothing really changed in her life. I would say everything changed in her life from the very beginning. She literally surrendered her life to the call of Jesus and was on mission for Him. And we used this verse last week to remind us of her becoming a witness for Him. Acts 1:8 says, "You will receive power when the Holy Spirit comes on you, and you will be my witnesses in Jerusalem and in all Judea and Samaria and to the ends of the earth." And that was true from the very beginning in Lottie's life. She formally received her call to missions in 1873. I've discovered that the more I read about her, it's like pieces of the puzzle that are getting put together, and I don't feel like I've gotten all the pieces to the puzzle on that culmination of her missionary call, because as they tell it in this biography, that was really just the official surrender in public. it seems as though Lottie was, that she was very intimately connected to China from the very, very beginning. I think that her and her family had some interaction with the Foreign Mission Board and were exchanging some letters from a very young age with missionaries in China. And I think the Lord had deeply put a love for the Chinese people and a recognition of their need for the gospel into her heart. And it seems as though she was desirous of going to the mission field much earlier than 1873. But as we talked about last week, at that point, the Foreign Mission Board was not sending single females to the mission field until 1871, 1872, when her sister first answered a call from Tarleton and Martha Crawford to come and help them, and she somehow convinced the board to send her as a female who was single. And so that kind of opened the door. And at that point, that's when Lottie and her friend Anna, who had come down with her from Kentucky, that's when they formally surrendered in the setting of their church there in Cartersville, Georgia. I was reminded, and I told you the story last week, how the pastor in Cartersville had gone to a missions conference, and he was all pumped up for trying to get missionaries to go onto the field. And so he came and he preached this rousing sermon, and he was hoping that at least one would respond, and then now he had 2 that went. But the backstory of that is God had already done all of that. And that was just kind of the formal ending of that story. And it just reminded me, isn't that the way that God usually works? You know, He's not just using us. That's one of the things that most impressed me, and not in terms of, oh, that was incredible, but one of the lessons that I most learned up at the Cove was, you know, as we are out doing the work of evangelism, God is not just relying on you for this person over here, and He's not just relying on you for this person over here, but we're all planting seeds and we're all watering seeds, and you never know what part of that you're going to play. But that's why we do the prayer work of evangelism. That's why I'm more motivated now to pray for my first cousin, who is far from Christ, doesn't know it. He thinks he's connected to Christ, but he's far from Christ, lives in Atlanta. You know, I've been a little bit unmotivated to pray for him because I don't have a lot of opportunities to interact with him on a regular basis and share the gospel. But one of the things that Lon Allison helped me to see is you need to be praying that God will send other Christians into his path, because other Christians can continue to plant those seeds and water those seeds, and then you never know when you have the next opportunity to have a gospel conversation with him what the Lord has been doing. And so I just want to encourage you, if there are people on your prayer list that you haven't been as faithful as you should be, simply because you've lost hope or because you've lost a connection, re-engage, because I guarantee you the Lord hasn't lost a connection with them. The Lord still has access to them. And if He has access to them, He also has access to people around them, and He can use those people around them. So that's kind of what He was doing in Lottie's life, is He was using a lot of circumstances that kind of culminated in this missionary calling by her local pastor there in Carterville, and then she surrendered. Now, she had been teaching at the Cartersville School for Girls for 2 or 3 years at this point. She and her friend Anna had come down from Kentucky at the insistence of her cousin, Pleasant Moon, who lived there. They got the coolest names in the world. But her cousin beckoned them down because he wanted to start this girls' school. And so they came, and they built it from nothing. It says they barely had a building to meet in because this was right after the Civil War. I think some guy named Sherman came through the South and burned most of the buildings down, and so it was hard to find a building. They found an old cannery that Lottie and her friend Anna, cleaned up and worked up and made it a nice school place. And they came down thinking that Pleasant had a large contingency of girls that were ready to be students. But as it turned out, I think there were like 13 girls to begin with. But they weren't discouraged. They got to work. They started doing the job. And then soon it was over 100 girls very quickly who were enrolled in the school. And And as she did with everything else in her life, she excelled at this. She was doing a great job as a teacher. Girls were loving that. And so they had a hard time when she shared with the girls that she had responded to the call to missions. The girls were very disappointed, but it was the reaction of their parents that really caught my attention. And we'll talk about why in just a second. So the girls, the students themselves were brokenhearted because they were losing their teacher. But in this biography, it says some of the girls' parents asked Pleasant Moon and the school's board why two young, talented women would want to waste themselves on the heathen in some far-off country when good Southern girls needed an education. Now, the reason that caught my attention is because in my years pastoring, there's always this dilemma, there's always this tension between international missions and local needs. And it seems as though most people fall more naturally into one category or the other. But I've heard from many church members, as we've talked about, for example, at my previous church, we had a pretty good ongoing partnership with a ministry in Zambia in Africa. And we had a lot of people that would go there regularly. We regularly raised funds. We're building a Bible college there and supporting students there. And on more than one occasion, I would have people come to me and say, why are we doing all that in Zambia when we got people who need Jesus right here? And, my response was always, well, you know what? We're not going to run out of Jesus. Jesus has all the resources we need, and he can affect both of these areas. But it's just interesting that that's basically what Lottie encountered as well. That there were people who thought it was a waste for her to leave these Southern girls who needed an education and instead move over to China and deal with the heathen. But she set out for China in 1873, and notice it was a 7-week journey just to get there. 7 weeks, that's 3 times as long, almost 4 times as long as any mission trip that I've ever been on from start to finish. It took her 7 weeks just to get there. That was 2 weeks to go across country from the Carolinas and Georgia over to San Francisco by railway, and then a good 5 weeks or so to sail. She couldn't just sail right to where she was going. Had to sail first to Japan and then get on a different boat and go to China. So we're talking about a massive trip to the other side of the world. But all of this she was willing to do because she was a purposeful Christian. She knew what her purpose was. And we ought to know what our purpose is. We ought to be willing to go out of our way and to endure some hardships for the sake of the gospel. And we ought to be willing to get out of the comfort zone of our church pews and get out into our community and get out into other parts of our world because people need to hear Jesus. We also briefly touched last week on the fact that she loved and labored for potential Christians. That's lost people, those lost Chinese people that didn't know Jesus. She had a heart to reach them, and she set out to do that in a number of different ways. First, she started a school for girls in Ting Chau, which is the port city that they went into. It was a walled city. I got to thinking about Jerusalem today and the wall around Jerusalem. Well, here's this walled city in Ting Chau. It was a city of about 80,000 people. The more well-to-do people than those that she would eventually minister to out in the villages. But she started a girls' school using the same experiences that God had prepared her for with the school in Danville, Kentucky, and then also in Cartersville, Georgia. So one of the things that we need to be doing as Christians is looking at the experiences that God allows us to go through and thinking, okay, Lord, what does this experience prepare me for? What are you doing in me in my present circumstance that will prepare me for a future circumstance? I think if we'll adopt that mindset, it will transform the way we look at suffering and hardships and difficult times, but also mundane times, those times where we just feel like nothing's happening. something's always happening. God is either doing something outside of us or in us or both, and we need to be aware of that because God used her teaching skills and her education. Remember last week I told you she was probably one of the 5 or so most educated women in the South. So she had a great education, and here God was able to use that in a mighty, mighty way. And she was willing to endure some difficult circumstances in the schools, much like she did in Cartersville when they started the school in Teng Chau. There weren't many girls who were willing to come. In that particular culture, most of the women were just being raised to be wives, and so there wasn't much of a value on education. Most of the parents didn't see fit to that. They just wanted to prepare these women to hand them off to the husbands that most of the time were already arranged marriages back from the time of their birth. And then even the girls that she was hoping that she would kind of get this high society group of girls, but she ended up getting more the runaways, those who were running out of a life of prostitution. So she had some unruly girls, but I read that she firmly believed that somewhere in the hearts of these often willful and unruly girls were the seeds of tomorrow's Christian women. Now, you want to know what I thought about the first time I read that quote? Change girls to children and change women or Christian women to followers of Jesus. She firmly believed that somewhere in the hearts of these often willful and unruly boys and girls were the seeds of tomorrow's followers of Jesus. Now, in our immediate context, what comes to mind? Awana, exactly right. That's exactly what came to my mind when I read this. You know, many of you have worked in Awana, and some of you have thought about working in Awana, and some of you have done this to working at Awana because of those often willful and unruly boys and girls. And I promise you, I didn't set out to make this an Awana pitch, but that's what I thought about when I read this. Here is Lottie Moon who said, you know what, I want to connect with these girls, and I want to love them and lead them, because these are the women who Jesus is going to get a hold of. And he's going to change China through these people. And I pray that we'll adopt more of that mindset. We've got a lot of very, very willing workers all around the areas of our church. But if you happen to be in that category of people that have kind of been on the borderline of trying to figure out, is that something I would be willing to do? Think about Lottie Moon. And no, you don't have to go to China. You just got to go downstairs. You just got to go into the gym. You just got to go into that mission field that we call Awana. So she started a school for the girls in Teng Chau. In the midst of that, as we talked about last week, she really had a heart for evangelism, personal evangelism, door to door, village to village. And so she started doing a lot of that with one of the other missionaries, Sally Holmes, who had been there for a lot longer. And it was difficult. There were lots of those journeys that were not easy. The travel was hard. I read about the journey from Teng Chau to Pingtu. I think it was about 30 miles, or maybe it was one of the middle cities to Pingtu. But it was a journey of about 30 miles, and it took her 4 days. That's how hard the travel was. But this is one of the things that she said, that this was from one of her letters, one of her many, 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 many letters. Most of what we know about Lottie Moon is because she wrote and wrote and wrote and wrote. One of the callings that she had in her life was to use her position to have influence with the Foreign Mission Board and with the churches back home. And we'll talk much more about that next week and the week after. But she wrote this in one of her letters: "As I wander from village to village, I feel it is no idle fancy that the Master walks beside me, and I hear his voice saying, I am with you always, even unto the end." Now, where does that quote come from? Where does that last part come from? That's Matthew 28. That's the end of the Great Commission. Remember how we said she was a purposeful Christian? And the verse I shared last week, the reason she was a purposeful Christian is because she believed that first part of the Great Commission where Jesus says, all authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. And that authority included authority over Lottie's life. And so she firmly believed the Lord Jesus has authority over me, and so I'm going to be obedient. I'm going to go and make disciples of all nations and baptize them and teach them all these things that he has commanded. And Jesus said, "Lo, I will be with you always, even to the end of the earth." And she said, "I felt that when I was traveling from village to village. I felt that when people were spitting in my face or calling me a foreign devil or ridiculing me or running us out of the city." And so we need to be aware of that promise too, and it needs to motivate us. In 1885, that's when she moved to Pingtu. This is where this book has really been helpful to me to understand that particular move. I talked to you a little bit last week about her vision, her dream that there be these mission stations, because she had endured the hardship of getting from Tingchow out into the villages and the having to travel as far as she could one day and then stay in these awful rat-infested inns and not get a good night's sleep. And it said that the first night she slept in one, she about scratched her skin to blood because of the awful conditions. And so her dream was, we need to establish these missionary posts kind of along the way. And it was interesting to then see how they did that with all of her missionary co-workers that came and went at a very rapid pace because of the harsh conditions in China. But they had a station in Tingchow with a few missionaries there, and then they had another in Shailing and Haishuan where they had the hospital, and then she was pretty much the furthest out in Pingtu, which is much like her to say, I'll be the one to go the furthest out into the worst conditions, because then we want to press on beyond that, because we know Pingtu is not the ends of the earth. We want to go beyond that, and so those who go further, they can come stay with me in Pingtu on the way. And so that's why she moved to Pingtu, and she began to establish those relationships with the villagers there, which was very different than her time in Tingchow in that walled city. And this is where she changed her approach. She normally had gone out into the streets knowing that just the fact that she was a white woman, which most of them had seen very, very few white people, but had seen no white women. So she knew just her presence there would always attract a crowd. You know, she could just go out into the streets of a village, and eventually there would be children running up to her. There would be women who would come up to her. My wife had that same experience in Zambia. They went to an orphanage in Zambia, and many of the kids would come up to her and they would scratch her skin, because they would expect that if they scratched it, they would see dark under her skin, because they weren't used to seeing a light-skinned girl with blonde hair. And so, Lottie saw a lot of that as well. But she changed her approach in Pingtu because the one missionary who had been out there said, it's different out in the village. If you just go out, yes, you will attract attention and you will draw a crowd, but you won't really have authority. You won't really have, you won't have an audience. You'll just have a crowd who wants to see you, but you won't have an audience who is willing to hear you. They need to approach you. And that's when she kind of changed her approach and said, okay, I'm going to bake cookies in the house, and I'm going to wait for them to come to me. And she began to really minister to them little by little, because she recognized, as it says in this quote here, we need to make friends before we can hope to make converts. And I hope you'll remember that quote, because this is not just a missionary quote. This is an evangelism quote. We need to make friends before we can hope to make converts. Now, that doesn't mean that we're not ever going to have the opportunity to share Christ effectively with those that we don't know, but especially in our immediate context, we're going to have more of an audience, and we're going to be heard more if the people around us know that we love them and care for them and are interested in their life. That's one of the reasons that Lon Allison, in his retreat that we went to up at the Cove, the model of evangelism that he teaches is the prayer, care, share model of evangelism. Pray for them up front and all along the way, and then demonstrate that you care for them. And then once you have demonstrated that, or as you are demonstrating that, then you share the seeds of the gospel with them. And you certainly see that happening in Lottie's life. Excuse me, let me find that point there. She loved and labored for potential Christians. Now, all of that is a little bit of review, but I want to get to at least a little bit of this tonight. One of the things that I've been very, very surprised about, one of the things I knew almost nothing about from Lottie's career, is that she partnered with problematic Christians. Now, how many of us partner with problematic Christians? I hope every one of us would raise our hand, because guess what every one of us are? We are problematic Christians. And I remember one of the first conversations that I had with Karen. We won't get very deep into this one tonight. I don't want to rush the information here. For those of you who don't remember, our new children's minister, Karen Bennett, is a lifelong IMB missionary. She spent about 20 years in Southeast Asia, Vietnam, Cambodia, Thailand, and many other places. As she ended up her last assignment, she was traveling from region to region, I think 8 different countries, working with the missionaries there who had children, working with them to help them adapt to a missionary culture, but also be successful parents at the same time. So they were in a difficult environment, and they had kids. Which, by the way, if you have kids, that's a difficult environment all by itself. And then you couple that with a foreign environment, and so part of her assignment was she would travel around and help families with that. And that's part of why we called her here, because that's what we want people to do here. We live, in many ways, in a foreign environment as Christians here. I taught Don Harper's Sunday school class Sunday, and I was reminding everyone that those sojourners, those strangers and aliens that we read about in 1 Peter 3, that's us. We live in a land that we don't belong to, in a culture that's very different from who we are as Christians, but we're called to be effective in evangelism in that. And so we think that Karen is going to be great for helping young families here raise their kids in a Christian way in a non-Christian world. And so we're excited, and she's proven to be super in that area already. But I remember one of the first things that she said to me as she was beginning to share stories about her interactions with other missionaries. She said, "Ryan, I want you to know missionaries are not perfect people. They're just people that are on mission for Jesus. But they got problems just like everybody else. And I've had to deal with some of those and help people deal with some of those. And believe me, Lottie dealt with a lot of those. It's been amazing to read. I'll tell you more of these stories next week. But one of the things that Lottie demonstrated herself to be good at over her long missionary career. Remember, she only came home 3 times in that whole career. And the rest of that time, she was out in the field living amongst mostly non-Christians, but even the Christians that she was living with were often a source of many of the problems that she dealt with. But she was known to be a peacemaker. She was known to be one who would partner with 2 people who were feuding and not take sides and not choose one over the other, but work with both of them. One of her co-worker missionaries that remains anonymous said the most remarkable thing was that Lottie was in the middle of a lifelong feud between colleagues, and we'll talk about that feud next week when we have some more time. But she was in the midst of this feud between other missionaries, and throughout it, she remained the friend of all families. What a great testimony for the person of Jesus working in and through her. And what a reminder from the Old Testament, or from the New Testament, where we're told, as much as it depends on you, you stay peaceable with the people around you. And that's an admission that you can't control the relationship completely, because relationships they're two-sided. And so it might be that in spite of all of your efforts and all of your grace and all of your patience, there may be some people that you just can't make that relationship work with. But the New Testament tells us that as much as is possible, we are to be peacemakers, and we are to maintain peace. Because remember what Jesus said about the number one distinguishing characteristic that the world would see in us that would show them that we are followers of him? What was that mark? What did he say? By this they will know that you are my disciples if you love one another. Now, last week we talked about the remarkable way that Lottie had at loving the Chinese people, but that wasn't what Jesus was talking about. He didn't say, they will know that you're my disciples if you're able to love them effectively. He said, the world is going to know that you're my disciples by the love that you have for one another. And this is just a reminder that none of us are perfect. Your pastor's not perfect. Phil's not perfect. Joe's not perfect. I know it's harder to believe that Phil's not perfect, but Phil's not perfect. And your Sunday school teacher's not perfect. And none of us are perfect. And one of the things that we see, when we have difficulties with construction and all the things that come along with it, and all the choices that we have to make, and anytime you make a choice, some people are going to love the choice, some people are not going to love the choice. But one of the things that we have to be committed to doing is, in the midst of all of it, we're going to love each other. And I was telling Don's class on Sunday as we were reading 1 Peter 3, and it says in verse 8, finally, all of you have unity of mind. And so Peter was saying, in the midst of difficulty, in the midst of persecution, in the midst of hardship, you need to have unity of mind. I was reminding them that does not mean uniformity. It doesn't mean that you all have to think the same thing and have the same opinion about everything. But having unity of mind goes back to that first point we made about Lottie Moon, which is that we are purposeful Christians. That we recognize what our purpose is. And as long as we as a body of Christ are pursuing that purpose, we're going to give each other grace in the midst of some other interpersonal difficulties. Lottie was really good at that. I think Lottie, the more I read about her, the more I see that she embodied what I read in Colossians 3. We'll close with this chapter, with this passage tonight. Listen to what Paul says in Colossians chapter 3 as he encourages us. You'll notice that he uses the language of putting something on. This is a wardrobe language here. This is clothing ourselves with one thing. The first 11 verses, or especially the verses leading up to this passage, is Paul telling us all the things that we need to take off. He says the world wants to put this on you. You take that off. You take off envy and jealousy and all of that stuff, and you put on, as God's chosen ones, holy and beloved, you put on compassionate hearts, kindness, humility, meekness, and patience, bearing with one another, and if one has a complaint against another, forgiving each other. As the Lord has forgiven you, so you also must forgive. And above all these, put on love, which binds everything together in perfect harmony, and let the peace of Christ rule in your hearts, to which indeed you were called in one body, and be thankful. Let the word of Christ dwell in you richly, teaching and admonishing one another in all wisdom, singing psalms and hymns and spiritual songs with thankfulness in your hearts to God. I want to caution you against reading this particular verse from an individualistic perspective. Paul is not talking to us as individuals here. He's not just saying, hey, Terry, I need you to make sure that you are dwelling in the word of Christ richly. And I need you to make sure that you are singing psalms and hymns and spiritual songs. No, he's saying as we all interact with each other, rather than holding grudges or doing anything negative, we need to recognize that the word of Christ dwells in us richly. We teach each other, we admonish each other, we worship with each other, and we are thankful with each other. And whatever you do in word or deed, do everything in the name of the Lord Jesus, giving thanks to God the Father through him. I'm very thankful for people like Lottie Moon, who in word and in deed did everything for the name of Jesus, for the glory of God. That's why there is an offering to this day that is named in her honor, because she has taught us well how to love the world around us in a sacrificial and selfless way for the sake of the gospel. Let's pray together.